He was abandoned by his family for pursuing his dreams, but years later, he was surprised by what happened. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. The air inside the house was stifling, tense with the weight of words unsaid. Daniel's hands clenched at his sides as he stood across from his father, Edward. The room felt too small for the two of them, though it was one of the largest in the house. His father's study, a place where decisions were made, where control was asserted. The old oak desk between them seemed more like a barrier now than a piece of furniture. You want to throw your life away? Over painting? Edward's voice was cold, laced with disappointment and disbelief. He had always been a man of clear expectations. Work hard, follow the path laid before you, take over the family business when the time comes. Art had no place in that world. I'm not throwing anything away, Dad, Daniel replied, trying to keep his voice steady, though his hands trembled. This is what I want. This is who I am. Edward's expression hardened, the lines in his face deepening with anger. Who you are? You are Kincaid. You don't get to just decide who you are. You follow the legacy that's been built for you. The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut, the same words he had heard throughout his childhood. Legacy, responsibility, duty. They were shackles to a life that suffocated him. A life where creativity was seen as weakness, and dreams were only worth pursuing if they involved profit. I can't live like this, Daniel said, his voice breaking slightly. I don't want to spend my life running the business. I want to create. I want to paint. Edward's eyes flashed with a mixture of fury and something else. Something Daniel couldn't quite place. And what happens when you fail? When you come crawling back, penniless and ashamed? What then, Daniel? Have you thought about that? Daniel flinched. His father's words cut deep because they echoed the fears that had kept him in place for so long. But he couldn't let those fears rule him any longer. If I fail, then I fail, Daniel said, his voice steadier now, more resolute. But at least I'll be failing at something I love. For a moment, silence filled the room. His mother, Caroline, stood in the doorway, her hands wringing together nervously. She had been watching the argument unfold, her face pale and tight with worry. Daniel could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to support him, but she also couldn't go against her husband. Her loyalty to Edward had always been unshakable, and Daniel knew she would never openly defy him, not even for her son. Edward turned away from Daniel, walking over to the window that overlooked the sprawling estate. The light from the setting sun cast long shadows across the room, making him appear even more imposing, more distant. If you walk out of this house, Edward said quietly without turning around, you will not be welcome back. Ever. You will no longer be a part of this family. You will be nothing to me. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. The finality of his father's words weighed heavily on him, but he had known this moment was coming for a long time. He had made his choice the day he decided to pursue his art, and now he had to live with the consequences. Without another word, Daniel turned and left the room, walking past his mother, who reached out as if to stop him, but let her hand fall to her side. He could feel her eyes on him as he walked down the long hallway toward the front door, but he didn't look back. If he had, he wasn't sure he would have had the strength to keep going. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Daniel stood on the steps of his family's mansion, the cool evening air hitting him like a splash of water. The world outside felt different, more real, more immediate, and full of uncertainty. His suitcase was already packed, sitting by the door where he had left it earlier in the day, knowing this would be the outcome of the conversation. As he walked down the long driveway, the mansion looming behind him, Daniel felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, freedom, sadness, and hope. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept walking, each step taking him further from the life he had always known and closer to the life he wanted to build. The city felt like a different world entirely. The noise, the people, the energy, it was everything his family estate was not. New York was alive, buzzing with possibility, but also indifferent, harsh, and unforgiving. Daniel rented a small room in a rundown building in Brooklyn, far from the polished halls of his father's mansion. The walls were thin, the neighbors loud, and the heating was unreliable at best. But it was his, and for the first time in his life, Daniel felt like he could breathe. The first few weeks were hard. His savings dwindled faster than he expected, and finding work was tougher than he had anticipated. He spent his days painting on cheap canvases, trying to capture the life around him. The gritty streets, the worn faces, the constant movement of the city. But selling his art proved difficult. Tourists weren't interested in the kind of raw, emotional pieces Daniel created. They wanted cheap, pretty pictures to take home as souvenirs. It wasn't long before Daniel found himself at rock bottom. His money was gone, his rent overdue, and the harsh reality of his decision to leave home was staring him in the face. Late one night, sitting alone in his apartment, surrounded by unfinished paintings and unpaid bills, Daniel wondered if his father had been right. Was he foolish to think he could make it on his own? Was he chasing a dream that was destined to fail? But even in his darkest moments, there was a small voice inside him that refused to give up. He had left everything behind for this. He couldn't turn back now. One afternoon, while setting up his paintings on a street corner in Soho, a woman stopped in front of his makeshift gallery. She was older, maybe in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and an air of confidence that made her stand out from the rest of the crowd. She studied his work for a long time, not saying a word, her gaze intense and focused. "You have talent," she said finally, her voice cutting through the noise of the city. "Real talent." Daniel blinked, unsure how to respond. He had heard plenty of compliments before, but something about the way she said it felt different. There was weight behind her words. "I'm Rachel," she continued, extending her hand. "I run a small gallery not far from here. We showcase up-and-coming artists. I think your work would fit in perfectly." Daniel's heart raced. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, but it felt almost too good to be true. "Come by the gallery tomorrow," Rachel said, handing him a card with the gallery's address. "Bring your best pieces. We'll see what we can do." The next day, Daniel arrived at the gallery, his hands shaking with nervous energy. The space was small but beautiful, with high ceilings and soft lighting that made the artwork on display come to life. Rachel greeted him warmly and spent the afternoon going through his pieces, offering feedback and encouragement. By the end of the day, she had selected 5 of his paintings to be part of an upcoming exhibition. Daniel could hardly believe it. After months of struggle, it finally felt like things were starting to turn around. The exhibition wasn't a huge success, but it was a step in the right direction. Critics took notice of his work, and while he didn't sell much, the recognition gave him a newfound sense of hope. Over the next few years, Daniel's career began to gain momentum. His paintings, filled with emotion and raw energy, captured the attention of the art world. He wasn't famous. Not yet, but he was on his way. Years passed, and Daniel's life shifted. The boy who had been thrown out of his home for choosing art over his father's legacy was now a man on the verge of success. His name was starting to circulate in the right circles, though it came with the caveat often attached to emerging artists: undiscovered potential, raw talent, a voice waiting to find its true audience. But these whispers were enough to keep Daniel going, enough to justify the sacrifices he'd made. Still, despite the growing recognition, a hollow feeling lingered inside him. Daniel's career was progressing, yet every success reminded him of what he had lost. Every painting sold, every exhibition opening, echoed with the silence from his past. His father's disapproval, his mother's resigned expression, the cold dismissal of the only home he had ever known. He found himself painting late into the night, pouring his frustrations, his anger, and his loneliness onto the canvas. His art grew darker, more abstract. He painted streets filled with people, but devoid of connection, cityscapes that seemed to swallow the individual. Critics began to notice a change in his style, commenting on the increasing intensity of his work. They marveled at his emotional depth, but none of them knew the source of that emotion. None of them knew the pain that had carved its way into his heart, guiding his brush strokes. Then, one evening, as Daniel returned to his small Brooklyn apartment after another late-night painting session, he found an envelope waiting for him in his mailbox. It was simple, plain, no address, no stamp. Just his name, written in a familiar hand. His heart skipped a beat as he stared at the handwriting. It couldn't be. It had been years since he had last heard from anyone back home. Slowly, with trembling hands, he opened the letter. "Daniel, I don't know if you'll ever read this, or if you'll even care, but your father, he's not well. The doctors say it's only a matter of time now. He's been asking for you, though he'll never admit it. Please come home. Love, Mom." The letter was brief, but it carried the weight of everything Daniel had tried to forget. His father was dying. The man who had cast him out, who had refused to acknowledge him for all these years, now wanted him to come back. Or at least his mother did. For a long time, Daniel just stood there, the letter crumpled in his hands, staring at the words as if they would change. His father, strong, unbending Edward Kincaid, was on his deathbed, and suddenly Daniel felt like the scared boy he had been when he left home. Part of him wanted to tear the letter to shreds, to pretend it didn't exist. He had built a life without his family, without his father's approval. Why should he go back now? But another part of him, smaller, quieter, whispered something else. What if this was his chance for closure? What if this was the last opportunity to confront the man who had shaped his life, for better or worse? The next morning, Daniel booked a flight. His mother's letter had included no details about his father's illness, but that didn't matter. The moment he stepped onto the plane, Daniel knew he couldn't turn back. He hadn't been home in nearly a decade, and the idea of returning filled him with a strange mix of dread and longing. When he arrived, the house was just as he remembered it, grand, imposing, a symbol of everything his father had built. The sprawling estate stood in stark contrast to the world Daniel now lived in. Its manicured lawns and polished marble floors a far cry from the gritty streets and cramped studio spaces he had come to know. As he stepped through the front door, he was greeted by silence. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and expensive leather, the same smells that had once been so familiar to him. His mother, Caroline, appeared in the hallway, her eyes widening in surprise. She looked older, more fragile, her once dark hair streaked with gray. "Daniel," she breathed, tears welling in her eyes. "You came." He nodded, unsure of what to say. The distance between them wasn't just physical. It had grown over the years, a chasm carved by silence and pride. But now, standing before her, Daniel could see the strain that had worn her down. She had been caught between her love for her son and her loyalty to her husband, a conflict that had weighed on her for years. She embraced him, her arms trembling as she held him close. "He's been waiting for you," she whispered. "He won't say it, but I know he has." Daniel pulled back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Where is he?" "In his study," she said softly. "He spends most of his time there now. He doesn't leave much anymore." Daniel nodded, the lump in his throat growing larger as he made his way down the familiar hallway. His father's study had always been off-limits to him as a child, a place where serious matters were discussed, where decisions about the future were made. Now, as he approached the door, he felt like that child again, nervous, unsure, waiting for his father's judgment. The door creaked as Daniel pushed it open, and there, sitting behind the massive oak desk, was Edward Kincaid. But this wasn't the man Daniel remembered. The man before him was gaunt, his skin pale and paper-thin. His once imposing figure was hunched over, frail, as if the very weight of his illness had crushed him. Edward looked up, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. Father and son, separated by years of silence and bitterness, now face to face for the first time in nearly a decade. "You came," Edward rasped, his voice weak, but unmistakable. It wasn't a question, more of an observation, as if he had known all along that Daniel would eventually return. "I did," Daniel replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know what else to say. The anger that had fueled him for so long seemed to evaporate in the presence of his father's frailty. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, oppressive, filled with all the things they hadn't said over the years. Finally, Edward broke it. "You've made a name for yourself," he said, his voice low and strained. "I've kept up with your work. Your mother, she showed me some of it." Daniel blinked, taken aback. His father had been following his career? He had thought Edward had completely cut him off, had no interest in his life after he left. "You didn't seem like you cared," Daniel said, his voice bitter despite himself. Edward sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I was wrong. I was wrong about a lot of things." The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. He had spent so many years imagining this moment, picturing himself confronting his father with all the anger and hurt he had carried. But now, hearing Edward admit his mistakes, all that anger seemed to dissolve, leaving behind only the pain of what could never be repaired. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Edward continued, his voice barely audible. "I thought if I could make you see the value of the life I built, you'd understand. But I didn't understand. I didn't understand you." Daniel stood there, the words swirling around him, heavy with the weight of years lost. He wanted to yell, to cry, to demand answers for all the hurt he had endured. But instead, he just stood there, his hands trembling at his sides, unsure of what to do with the emotions coursing through him. Edward's breath rattled in his chest, and he closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his strength. "I was wrong, Daniel," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I pushed you away, and now I don't have much time left to make it right." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unexpected. Daniel had never imagined hearing those words from his father. For years, he had carried the weight of his father's rejection, letting it fuel his ambition and drive him to succeed. And now, with Edward's fragile voice admitting fault, the resentment that had lived in Daniel's chest for so long began to crumble, piece by piece. "I didn't think you'd ever admit it," Daniel said quietly, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and relief. "For so long, I thought you hated me." Edward shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. "I never hated you, Daniel. I just didn't understand you. You were always different. Your mother and I, we tried to raise you the way we knew, but your dreams, they were bigger than this house, bigger than I could comprehend. I wasn't strong enough to let you go." The two men sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fireplace and the ticking of the clock on the wall. In that moment, Daniel saw his father not as the larger-than-life figure who had controlled his world, but as a flawed, vulnerable man, a man who had been afraid, just like him. Slowly, Daniel rose from his chair and walked over to the bookshelf that lined one wall of the study. His eyes roamed over the titles, old volumes on business strategy, finance, and world economics. But one small book hidden behind the others caught his eye. It was an old sketchbook, dusty and worn, its pages yellowed with age. Curious, Daniel pulled it from the shelf. "I never knew you sketched," Daniel said, flipping through the pages. The drawings were rough, unpolished, but full of emotion. Landscapes, still lives, and abstract forms that seemed to explode off the page. He looked up at his father, who was watching him with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. Edward chuckled weakly. "I wasn't very good at it, but when you left, I started drawing. I didn't understand your world, but I thought maybe if I tried, I could see what you saw. It helped me understand you better." Daniel sat back down, the weight of the sketchbook in his lap heavy with meaning. He traced his fingers over the pages, imagining his father, alone in this study, pouring out his emotions onto the paper. It was as if, through these drawings, his father had been trying to reach out to him all along, even when they hadn't spoken. "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel asked softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't think you'd care," Edward replied, his eyes downcast. "I thought I had lost you for good." The room fell silent again, but this time, the silence was not filled with the bitterness of the past. Instead, it was filled with something else: understanding, forgiveness, and the possibility of healing. As the night wore on, Daniel and his father continued to talk, peeling back the layers of their complicated relationship. Edward told him stories from his own youth, of dreams he had abandoned in favor of building the family business. Daniel, in turn, shared his journey, the struggles, the triumphs, and the loneliness of pursuing a life that often felt at odds with the world around him. By morning, something had shifted between them. The rift that had once seemed insurmountable had narrowed, and though they could never get back the years they had lost, they both knew that the future held the possibility of something new. A few days later, Edward passed away, peacefully, with Daniel and Caroline by his side. In his final moments, Edward had smiled at Daniel, a smile filled with pride and love. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a sense of closure, a peace he had thought he'd never find. But the story didn't end there. Weeks after the funeral, Daniel received a call from Rachel, the gallery curator who had helped launch his career. "There's someone you need to meet," she said, her voice full of urgency. "I can't explain over the phone, but it's important." Intrigued, Daniel made his way to the gallery. As he stepped inside, he was greeted by a middle-aged man in a finely tailored suit, his expression serious but not unkind. "My name is Charles," the man said, extending a hand. "I represent your father's estate." Daniel's brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't understand. The estate was settled. What more is there?" Charles smiled faintly. "Your father left something for you. It's not money or property, but something much more valuable." He handed Daniel a leather-bound folder, its contents sealed with a red ribbon. Daniel took it, his hands trembling slightly. As he opened it, he found a series of legal documents, but it was the final sheet that made his breath catch in his throat. The gallery, Rachel's gallery, was his. Edward had quietly purchased it years ago, under an alias, and had been funding its operations ever since. The man who had once scorned Daniel's artistic ambitions had been his silent benefactor, supporting his career from the shadows. "I don't understand," Daniel whispered, his mind reeling. "Why didn't he tell me?" Charles shrugged gently. "Maybe he didn't know how. Or maybe he thought you wouldn't accept it if you knew. But your father was proud of you, Daniel. More than you'll ever know." Daniel stood there, stunned, the weight of his father's secret support crashing down on him. All those years, he had thought he was alone, that his father had abandoned him. But in reality, Edward had been there all along, quietly ensuring his success, even as he kept his distance. The revelation filled Daniel with a mixture of emotions, gratitude, sorrow, and a strange sense of vindication. His father hadn't been the villain he had imagined, but a man bound by his own fears and regrets, trying in his own flawed way to make things right. With the gallery now in his name, Daniel knew that his life was about to change once again. But this time, he wasn't chasing approval or running from the past. This time, he was walking into the future with open eyes, armed with the knowledge that his father had believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. In the end, Daniel's art had not only become his salvation, it had redeemed his father as well. The canvas of their lives, once torn and broken, had been mended in the final, most unexpected stroke of all. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.